I was asked by the Foundation to spend a few minutes talking about the British experience and about Brexit. We're not in the Eurozone, but we are talking about pursuing some very different economic models over the next few years, if indeed Britain votes for Brexit in 39 days' time. How does it look right now? That's the general picture of travel. Support for staying in the European Union is in blue. Support for leaving the European Union is in red. This chart is actually about 2 weeks out of date. The average over the last 6 opinion polls has leaving the EU on 50%, remaining in the EU on 50%. So it is a dead heat. Depending on what opinion polls you look at, some polls by telephone but remaining in the EU a few points ahead, polls undertaken on the internet have Brexit a few points ahead. But what I do find quite remarkable about the British referendum is that the race is still within the margin of error, despite the warnings of economic Armageddon, despite the visit from President Obama, despite the IMF saying there is no economic benefit to come from Brexit. And as the Eurosceptics would argue, many of the same people who now say that Brexit would be a disaster also said that if Britain doesn't join the euro, it would be a disaster. So the race is very close. And that's how it looks in terms of geography. Those who are voting for Brexit, or planning to vote for Brexit at the referendum, come from the east coast of England, but they come from communities that have a much lower level of economic development and which have also experienced, on average, higher levels of migration from across the EU over the last 12 years. You can see how London is very much in favour of staying in the EU, as are some of the other big urban, younger, more diverse cities like Manchester, Nottingham and Birmingham. Though it is rather ironic that many of the people who want to stay in the EU were also firmly opposed to austerity. So I can't quite understand that particular position, but that's in general how it looks. There is a big debate at the moment in Britain about turnout on the day. What we're seeing in all of the surveys is that those who support Britain leaving the EU are about 10 points more likely to say that they will turn out on the day of the referendum. Those who say they want to stay in the EU, who typically are between 18 and 39 years old, are noticeably less likely to say they will turn out on the day. So much is going to depend upon how the two campaigns mobilise votes in those different areas of the country. It's also clear that both sides of the debate are winning in very different areas. If you look at the Brexit camp and the Eurosceptics, and what I'm doing here is presenting results from all recent opinion polls and surveys, okay? Eurosceptics are winning the argument on immigration. This is showing you the net score on these questions, so the percentage of people who agree minus the percentage of people who disagree, okay? So the Eurosceptics are winning on immigration and they're winning on the National Health Service. Larger numbers of people believe that leaving the EU would be better for the National Health Service, and they're also winning on terrorism. But the Eurosceptics are actually losing on the economic argument, which is what I find very interesting. The pro-EU campaign has been very successful at framing Brexit as an economic risk, which, given the contents of this conference, is quite an interesting point, but they have successfully framed Brexit as an economic risk. People view leaving the EU as being bad for jobs, as being bad for the national economy, and also as being bad for their own personal economic position. And in short, nationally, more people view Brexit as the bigger risk than people who view it as an opportunity. So I think looking at France, this speaks very loudly to your debate, possibly in the future, where you've seen both sides of the referendum become highly polarised and become quite driven by very different motivations. In fact, if you just look at those who are going to support Brexit and those who are going to support staying in the EU, what is quite interesting is that the Eurosceptic vote is driven far more strongly by identity concerns, whereas the vote to stay in the EU is driven far more strongly by the perceived economic benefits of staying in the EU. Now, you can all make your own minds up as to why lots of people believe that remaining in the EU is an economic benefit, but it is a challenge for Eurosceptics in Britain, that economic territory. The identity territory is actually very much won by the Eurosceptics. So what are the alternative economic models that are being advocated by Britain's Eurosceptics? And let's imagine for a second that Britain did actually vote voted to leave the EU. There are essentially three different models that have been debated within British Euroscepticism. And let me talk you through two and then quickly the one that they've decided on. The first idea early on was essentially to relocate Britain within the European Economic Area, or the so-called Norway model, or what Eurosceptics in Britain would call the soft exit model. Under this model, Eurosceptics argue that Britain will still be able to trade with Europe, will still be able to pursue economic integration, but it will be able to avoid the more centralised political integration, that it will have access to the single market, with some exceptions from agriculture and fishing, and that this is a fairly straightforward model for British Eurosceptics to pursue, given that it has been in place for a long time. However, this model was quickly abandoned given many of the obvious problems that come with Britain wanting to remain within the EEA. There's no fundamental change in the economic relationship with the EU. We'd make broadly comparable financial contributions. We'd still be obliged to impose European Union law, and we would lose voice within the democratic arenas, and it would do absolutely nothing to deal with that core issue for Eurosceptics in Britain, which is the free movement of people. So the EEA model was quickly abandoned, which led Eurosceptics to then think about a second economic model or way forward, namely to reposition Europe within the European Free Trade Association, the so-called Swiss option, or Britserland. And the idea here would be to essentially reposition Britain within EFTA and sign a series of bilateral trade agreements with other countries outside of the EU. And this is where Eurosceptics began to argue that Switzerland has opened up economic markets worth around 40 trillion euros, and that Britain would also be able to pursue closer relations with other advanced economies, and it would become much more dependent upon non-EU trade going forward. So, it was an idea. In particular, if you look at economists like Roger Bootle or Daniel Hannan and others, they've talked as well about the importance of the Commonwealth connection within this broader framework, that Britain would essentially spend a far greater amount of time developing links with emerging economies within the 54 Commonwealth nations that comprise around 2 billion people and which have the English language and similar institutions. But again, there are clear complications. The Switzerland-EU deal, of course, took 6 years to make. It is not clear how the EFTA model would protect financial services, on which the British economy is heavily dependent. And free movement, as we know from the Switzerland case, would still likely be imposed on the British people, who would have voted for Brexit largely because of their concerns over immigration. So that takes us to the final model, which is where we are today, and which is what is being put in front of the British people, and that is essentially what you might call a bespoke package for Britain, which would see Eurosceptics and the new Prime Minister of the day, because if Britain votes for Brexit, David Cameron will have to resign, probably within a week. It would see Britain forge its own free trade agreement with the European Union, or according to Michael Gove, who is a Conservative MP leading the Eurosceptic movement, Britain would forge its own deal with the EU, a continent-wide free trade area embracing a wide range of bilateral deals, and that would be the core of the new arrangement. It's not like the European Free Trade Association, but would see Britain positioning within a broader free trade area and trying to forge its own FTA, or free trade agreement, with the EU. And this is where Eurosceptics point to advanced economies like Canada and say, look, you know, Canadians have signed 10 major free trade deals over the last, well, since 2009. And the aim here would be, again, to bolster the British economy, bolster UK exporters and importers to EU markets, and to replace free movement with an Australian-based point system, which significantly not only is supported by members of David Cameron's own cabinet, but is also supported by influential spokespersons within civil society. There are some questions that remain, whether the free trade agreement with the EU would cover services which would protect London, on which Britain relies heavily. It's also quite clear that other developed economies would be quite wary of signing free trade agreements with Britain until that deal with the EU is concluded. And obviously, in order to try and prevent contagion, there is no guarantee as to what the European Union would be willing to offer Britain, or allow Britain to put into place during the 2-year negotiation period. And there is a strong belief that the EU, for fairly obvious reasons, would play hardball with Britain and try to set an example. There's also some data and some reports that have been coming into the British debate in recent years, in recent days, which have argued that replacing EU membership with the free trade agreement would result in a 6% fall in overall GDP, which was put forward by the Treasury Department in recent weeks. Interestingly, those warnings have had very little impact on British public opinion, so the economic argument in a way seems to be priced in to the overall debate, which leads some individuals, some economists in Britain, to advocate a more radical option, which is for Britain to walk completely away from any free trade agreement with the EU, and rather to revert to the World Trade Organization and to continue to trade with the EU under WTO rules and regulations, and not to pursue any close relationship with the EU. Now, the economists in the room will know which of those models is most favourable and amenable, and which are not. But the one final point is that Eurosceptics are being deliberately vague about what they want to follow because of the Scottish experience. The moment Alex Salmond set out his economic vision for Scotland, it was torn apart by the Bank of England and by the European Union. So the reason that British Eurosceptics are only hesitantly putting forward this third model, and the reason that they are being quite vague on detail, is because they do not want to emulate the experience of the Scottish National Party, which put out a big blueprint for its economic future, and which was subsequently torn apart by the government of the Bank of England and the European Union. But if Britain votes for Brexit in 5 weeks, it is very likely that that third model is the model that Britain will be pursuing, perhaps under Prime Minister Boris Johnson. I leave you with that thought.